And we're joined on the phone today by Gavin Edwards. He's the author of the book Kindness and Wonder, Why Mr. Rogers Matters Now More Than Ever. Hey, Gavin, how's it going today?
I'm all right. How about yourself, Dustin?
I'm excellent. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's 100% my pleasure.
Well, let's talk about your new book here, Kindness and Wonder, Why Mr. Rogers Matters Now More Than Ever. Can you tell the listeners a bit about the new book?
So this book is half of it is a biography of the remarkable Mr. Rogers, host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But the half that I think the reason I wrote the book is the second half, which is it's called 10 Ways to Live More Like Mr. Rogers Right Now. And I feel like, sort of like the world is like louder, it's cruder. It feels like every day there's just sort of this like drumbeat of nastiness. But for anyone who grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, sort of you carry some of his like moral sense and his light within you, and it is not that hard to like awaken it and help push the world towards being a better place.
Yeah, it does seem like if Mr. Rogers, if he were around today still doing his show, he'd really have his work cut out for him, as you mentioned, with the country kind of being divided and people just kind of seeming to be unkind these days more than usual.
I completely agree, but I think he would rise to the challenge. He always did. That even when it was stuff that he found overwhelming, whether it was like political assassinations in the 1960s or things that he didn't grow up with, like divorce, he found a way to sort of like if we taught. One of his credos was if it's mentionable, then it's manageable. And so he always believed if I can talk about it with the children, then I can find a way to explain it, and that will help them, sort of like understand it and be able to, sort of deal with it in their own ways.
Yeah, it does seem like as adults, when you go back and watch the show with your own kids, you really realize that obviously the show was meant for kids, but I mean, Fred Rogers, he was really doing a lot of stuff that was, maybe radical in a sense, as far as like, race relations, and a lot of stuff that he was covering really was, it was good info for everybody, I think.
Absolutely. It was both, sort of an extremely progressive show, and was also amazingly subtle and thought through in its own way. It wasn't just like, oh, hey, let's get in front of the camera with some puppets and improvise our way through a show, which he had done previously in like the 1950s, a show called Children's Corner. But this one was very carefully scripted. It was very grounded in, sort of like his experience of studying child development. One of my favorite small details is that he didn't drill like letters and numbers the way Sesame Street did. Like he was tuned into like kids' emotional development, but he did do something to help like get them ready to read, which was he would always stage the action on the show from left to right whenever he could. He comes in that door, walks down the stairs, left to right. The trolley goes off to the neighborhood to make believe, left to right. Just getting kids in that habit.
Yeah, and it's definitely, as you mentioned, a lot of the little things. It was a kid's show again, but with all the stuff you're mentioning there, and I mean, just the music that was involved and a lot of stuff, I mean, there was a lot going into that program.
Absolutely. And, and he did, obviously there were other people working on the show, but he did a remarkable amount of it himself. That, he wrote many of the scripts and edited the ones he didn't write. He wrote hundreds of songs. He did most of the puppets. And so he had all this like astonishing collection of talents that when he was growing up, he didn't really know what to do with them until, sort of like it turned out that like making this television show for children was like the perfect venue for him. Like he found his life's calling.
Excellent. Again, Gavin Edwards with us, and his new book, Kindness and Wonder, Why Mr. Rogers Matters Now More Than Ever, is out now. And it seems like with your book and the documentary that was out a while back, the Tom Hanks film coming up, Mr. Rogers is really back in the public eye here more than he has been in quite a while. I
think that's true, and sort of later in his life, he made a point of trying to like remind people of what he had taught them when they were children. Sort of like he gave lots of college graduation speeches, and he would go around and speak with adults, and if he could sort of talk to them for half an hour, because many people grow up on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but then you kind of forget specifically what he taught you. It's just like he gives you that moral underpinning, but you don't think, oh, I'm 17 years old, and like, what would Mr. Rogers do? But then when you like become an adult, like, and you sort of uncover that it's almost like this treasure inside of you that, oh, here's a man who, sort of like taught me to listen to people and taught me to be kind and taught me to sing and taught me to like accept like changes as they came. It's paying off for me anyway, decades later.
Definitely. And Gavin, I wanted to ask you about how you put the book together. I know you've had quite a few interviews in there with different folks, and a lot of background info that a lot of people probably haven't known before.
So some of it was just sort of like going into the archives, sort of finding like other like interviews he had done while he was alive. But I actually drove to the Fred Rogers Center, which is in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, where he grew up, and spent some time like just going through, like they've got files and files, and you can see where he marked up scripts and said like okay, Henry Pussycat says 3 meow 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 meows, let's make it just 2, or like here's like the letters he wrote to people. So it was great to just sort of see sort of like a paper trail he left behind. But then the other thing I did was just like speaking with as many people as I could whose lives he touched, and in some cases that was people who worked on the show or people who appeared on the show, like Lynn Swan and Rita Moreno. But it was some people who just like wrote him a letter. Like there was one man who had suffered a terrible loss when his daughter had died young, and like they wrote a heartbroken letter to Fred Rogers, just thanking him for like the role he had played in his daughter's life, and expecting, oh, maybe I'll get a form letter or a photograph. I just want to say thank you. But 2 days later, Fred Rogers calls him up and like ministers to him and says, "Do you want to talk about it?" And he had a real sense of responsibility towards the people who were watching the show, and so it was not hard to find people who had experiences like that, because every single day, wherever Mr. Rogers went, he would have interactions like that.
Yeah, he was definitely an incredible guy, and we actually had David Newell on the show a couple of years back, and he seems like he's really doing a lot of work now to kind of keep the legacy of Fred Rogers going.
There is, it's great to see, and like everyone does it in different ways, and the David Newell, who your listeners may remember as the speed delivery man, Mr. McFeely on the show, and also handled PR for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. The show is not in perpetual rotation on PBS anymore, but they're making Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, and they're definitely trying to keep the spirit alive in a different venue. And sort of, I hope that with things like the movie and the book, like each in their own way, like remind people of why they like love Mr. Rogers and what he like brought to them. And if just like even 3% of the day, people have a moment or two here and there where they say, "Oh, let me try to sort of like set an example. Let me try to like really listen to this person and find out what they need." Like we'll all be better off for it.
Yeah, and it is sad in a way that we seem like we need it now more than ever. And as you mentioned, you could still get Mr. Rogers. You kind of have to dig for it now, though. It's not on readily available for kids like it was all those years ago. Right.
I mean, it's easy enough to find if you're looking for it. There's some wonderful DVD sets. There's many episodes streaming on Amazon Prime. But it's not something where you just like turn on the TV and it's there. And I certainly found, with my kids, like I didn't think to show it to them until like really it was a little too late. The show is designed for preschoolers, and I showed it to a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old, and they're like, "Oh, it's sweet," but like it's not designed for them. It's made for younger kids who are trying to figure out like sort of fundamental things about the world. And so, parents, if you have like kids who are like around kindergarten or going in there, this is your chance. Show them a few episodes of Mr. Rogers. You'll probably be glad you did.
Well, Gavin, I know the book is just out now, but is there something else coming up or something else we should be looking out for from you?
Right now it's the book. I'm still figuring out what the next thing is, and I also write a lot for the New York Times, so people can look out for my byline there. But just going out and spreading the good word of Mr. Rogers.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. The book is great, and hopefully I can speak with you again down the road.
I'd like that a lot, Dustin. Thank you.
And again, that was author Gavin Edwards, and his new book, Kindness and Wonder, Why Mr. Rogers Matters Now More Than Ever, is available now.